And you said it changed your view. Was it because one of the big things was you reporting for KALX and you were quite active,
Yes.
right?
I was, yeah. I mean, it was KALX. CalX was the radio station. It was a news and music. I applied and I got the job, and getting the job there was volunteer. And that was probably, at the time, I thought it was my first news or journalism job, but I don't believe it was. I'll tell you why after. But I was reporting on Senator Dianne Feinstein now, who was the first woman to represent the state of California in the U.S. Senate. I was covering her election. And also covered Magic Johnson getting AIDS. And that was a big deal, right? HIV. It was a big issue back then. This is the early 90s. And I also covered the beating of a black man by police caught on tape, Rodney King. And little did I know that all of those would follow me throughout my life. Now that I'm a journalist today and reporting on similar storylines like Rodney King, it's hard to believe the time's gone by, but nothing's changed, or very little has changed when it comes to race in America on that point. But yeah, CalX was fantastic. Really enjoy it. I was trying to get the tapes of the reporting from way back then. There are none. There are none. Yeah.
Were those very transformative experiences that convinced you that I want to be a journalist? Because these are not easy topics to cover.
Ling Ya, the answer is no. Because after that, when I graduated, I worked in marketing and advertising and worked in tech. So I guess if it was inspirational, it's not something that I immediately moved into. Now that I've been a journalist for 15 years professionally and getting paid for it, I do think back to that time of CalX put in my brain. But the first time I think I was doing something journalistic was actually in high school, when me and a buddy put together a newsletter at a church camp, and he and I would write it every night overnight and then slip it underneath everybody's door. And it was the Daily Bugle was the name of this newsletter, this newspaper that we would put out for every day. So it's interesting because journalism was kind of like a skipping rock, boop, boop, right? And then finally it landed 15 years ago when I left a startup in Singapore and said, I've always wanted to try to be a journalist. Let's go. And so I tried it. And 15 years later, here I am.
Before being a journalist, you joined Clean Environment Equipment. I believe you did that because you met this guy called Mike Breslin.
Yeah. So when I was at Berkeley, I was looking for a job, and I went to the job board and I saw, hey, there's a job from a place called Clean Environment Engineers, and they're looking for a marketing assistant. So I applied. It's a small technology company that cleans up underground fuel spills. So you've seen the oil tankers in Southeast Asia, and they'll come in and then in the US, a lot of those tanks are very far inland, and they will, everywhere in the world they are, and they'll leak into the ground. So he had technology to clean up those spills that would leak into the groundwater that you would drink. Yeah, he was great. I worked with him for 5 years. In the book, I talk about him a lot because I think he was a great mentor of good values.
You say his servant leadership inspired you.
That's
especially,
correct.
I mean, he really led during the recession as well, which is a very difficult time.
Yes, during the recession, he paid himself $0 so that all of us could keep a job. He reduced our pay by, I forget, 20 or 30%. I can't remember what it was, 20%. But he reduced his by 100%. But he didn't tell us. What he did after that, Ling Ya, is he created a retirement system for us. And for a small company that grew from 10 people to 50 when I left, you don't create retirement systems it's very expensive to create a retirement system, but he did it. He was great. He was really great in that he would say, Richard, what are you talking about? That's nothing big. And I was like, no, you don't understand. This is a good way to do business. This is the right way to do business. Treat your people like people. And that inspired me later on during this latest recession that we've all lived through, and I think are making it through the other side. When I had an employee whose job also got canceled because of the recession, I said, I'll pay him then. And so he became an employee of the group that is building the movie and helped to build the book. And I think back because of Mike Breslin when he did the same for us. He didn't think twice, he just did it.
And so after that, you were at various positions at Lazarus and also at Mercer before you eventually moved to Singapore for Citibank. What was behind that move? I mean, it must have been a huge shift to go from the States to Asia.
It was really enjoyable. I mean, I enjoyed Asia. This is in 2001. It was a big shift, but man, did we love it. We were creating a fintech business model related to payments. And we were working with Citibank, Maybank, and ABN AMRO. And it was the first of its kind. It was a bank-centric payment system. We had it patented. Everybody thought, ooh, this new tech thing, right? It was the middle of the tech boom and then the bust of '01. We learned a lot, put it that way. But it was great to be in Asia, and we're working with some great banks, some great institutions that were really being innovative about how to reduce costs in payments. Again, a really important experience for me because, Lingyao, that if I didn't do that, I don't think I'd be a news anchor.
Why'd you say that?
I was originally going to business school when I went to Michigan, and then I went to Singapore to do the startup, to move away from small companies, instead work for big companies. Because I was working for technology startups and I wanted to move into Fortune 500. So I went to MBA and I wanted to work in strategy consulting at Mercer. And Mercer was very kind to me, now Oliver Wyman. Had I just gone down that route of strategy consulting, I would have been in New York or San Francisco and just going to do my projects. There was no business to develop. There was no business to be sold. There was no business development. There was no pitching to investors. There was no making new relationships internationally, right? Not to that degree, right? Where we were the principals. We were the 4 founders of the business. It was up to us to push and make it happen with Citibank, ABN AMRO, and Maybank. So when we sold it to Singapore Technologies, then we stayed on a year. That was sort of the crux of, okay, we finished this through. Now what? Now, if you don't have now what's in your life, those great intersections, sometimes you're just running on the treadmill. You know what I'm talking about. Running as a lawyer. You're running, transaction after transaction, client after client, right? Case after case, project after project. Got to become a junior partner, got to become a partner, got to become a managing partner, whatever it is, right? Same with consulting. So because I had reached a natural end to that startup, we sold it. We did our 1 year helping them take it into their system. We finished doing that. We're like, okay, well, do we go back to consulting? Do I go back to my job, which Mercer at the time was very kind and they still held it for me. And the other founders, they went back to their jobs. One went back to McKinsey. One went back to Procter and Gamble. Many of us did. And I didn't. I decided I would give it a go. Because when you reach those intersections, everything is open and new again. And one of those open and new things for me was to consider journalism. And my partners, my fellow founders, I asked them, should I do it? Should I not do consulting and instead become a news anchor? They said, don't do the news anchor thing. Go back because my first job as a news anchor was at Channel News Asia in Singapore. And they were kind enough to take me in. And I was there for a year and a half, 2 years. And then I moved to the US to work for CNN Worldwide.
When you were at Channel News Asia, that was a pretty interesting time because the Sukarno family was defeated. Our Mahathir just stepped down.
Yeah.
Huge.
It is, I mean, huge for Malaysia. Absolutely. Change of an era, right? In Malaysia specifically, it was a change in Taiwan. I mean, it was Indonesia. I mean, we were just seeing great eras in politics change, and getting to cover all of that was an honor too. I was learning a lot, right? And Asia's moving so quickly since then, as it feels like 100 years ago, right? But yes, it was an exciting time politically.
Did anything stand out for you during that period of covering what was, for us, a very huge moment politically?
I think what stood out for me was the big sort of what is next. Are we going to see the next generation of what politics might mean in Southeast Asia? Or are we going to see more of the same or something in between? We saw something in between. But the opportunity for the next generation to get in there and be part of the system, because many of these were younger eras, right? They hadn't been around for hundreds of years. Instead, you had an era that was very special to Malaysia, Indonesia, and Taiwan. But would they now? You remember in the new millennium, people were wondering, well, in the new millennium, are things going to be radically different? Because we just passed 2000, right? Everybody thought, oh, everything's going to be brand new. Now you have new leadership in Malaysia, new leadership in Taiwan, new leadership in Indonesia. Who would be those new leaders that would rule and help lead their countries into the new millennium? I think that's what the thematic I took away from it.
And was it an easy transition to go from Channel News Asia to CNN?
Channel News Asia and living in Asia for the amount of time that I did, and then living in Spain when I was in college didn't make me an expert of international policy or politics, but it did prepare me for understanding the differences of countries, that they're there and that you need to be respectful of them. And that just because I come from the US and my view is one, it's only one. And it's just my view. So transitioning to CNN Worldwide, I was well prepared because of what they trained me at Channel News Asia, because they had me produce, they had me report, they had me anchor, and that was all very helpful. You got all of those exposures, edit, tracking, using our voices like we're doing right now with podcasts. All of those were lessons I got from Channel News Asia. So they prepared me very, very well for what I was about to get into.
Do you ever have any doubts that you would not survive this totally new field?
Yes. From the beginning, I thought you got to go for it. And if you don't get it done, you can do something else. I was lucky enough to go to good schools that gave me good skills. And I felt if I didn't make it to any of the networks, that I would just go back to business consulting, because I also loved it. I love problems and solving them. And I like creating new value, new models that will solve problems in responsible ways. But yeah, I was like, I don't know. I have no idea, but you got to go for it. So the interesting thing is that I owed Mercer a lot of money because they paid for half my education. And so when I got my first job at Channel News Asia, it wasn't a lot of money compared to what I was going to get paid as a business consultant. And so I actually made negative money my first year because I had to write a check for 70,000 USD back to pay back Mercer because they were so kind enough to pay for my education. But the deal was, if you don't go back to work for them, you got to pay back the gift. So I didn't go back. I had to write the check at 2 installments. I had to write 2 checks, and it was the biggest numbers I've ever seen. And I made negative money. So Asian parents were not happy about that all over the world.
But your dad wasn't that against it.
No, he wasn't. No, that's why I said Asian parents all over the world were upset with me. Instead, my dad, when I called him, I said, hey, you know what? I talked to my mom first, and she said, okay, you can talk to Baba and tell him what he thinks, tell him what you're going to do. And I call and I tell him, so I'm not going to take the job, and I have to write this check, and I'm going to become a news anchor, or attempt to be. And he laughed. He said, Richard, I always knew you were a different kid. That's great. Go do it. But he laughed. He wasn't laughing at me. He was laughing with me, right? Just really? You're going to do that? I said, yeah, I'm going to do that. Okay. All right.
I imagine it wouldn't have been easy to make it in that field. So, I mean, like you have said often that it's like a 25-hour per day, 8-day-a-week job. So what were you doing to make a name for yourself?
Yeah, it's not an easy job. You just work hard, and hopefully over time, it'll come through. It's just been a lot of work, and I've enjoyed it all. I mean, I first started at 30 Rock in New York. I worked 30 days straight. I've worked 45 hours straight. If you're in the business, everybody does it. I'm not unique that way, but it is a big requirement.
What separates a good from a great journalist? The fact that you were the first Asian American male to anchor national cable news show, and that was significant.
That was really surprising because I don't know if that's true, but there aren't a lot of Asian American males that are anchoring. It's just not common. The issue is we need more folks that want to do it. And we also need more folks to understand that it's important to have that representation. And when my colleague, she turned over to me when it happened, and she's like, Richard, this is important. So I was like, really? So yeah, this is what's just happened. I said, wow. And she was really kind of her to actually, first of all, know it and do the research, right? But she was my co-anchor. And so it's very, very nice of her. But yeah, that's where representation does count. It does count.
I want to pick one thing that you did there before we move on to MSNBC, which is you got the Peabody and Emmy awards for the team reporting on Hurricane Katrina and the Gulf oil spill. So what was that like, just working with that team to cover something so significant?
At CNN, it was just like, wow, it's really impressive to be able to work for an organization that is all over the world and that has so much reach. And I was honored to be part of the team, and our team was huge. Like, it was just all over the world. We were spread out to cover all of these different issues, whether it was Hurricane Katrina or any other story. CNN's ability to get to the location anywhere in the world immediately was something I always was impressed by and honored to be a part of.
Can you share a bit about how that happens? Like when Hurricane Katrina happened, how the whole team assemble and get onto the ground? What is it like?
So we have what I'll call a strike team. We have all of these containers ready for such incidents. Now, Hurricane Katrina was by the largest in the United States history at that point for deploying international correspondents, war correspondents into a U.S. city. And that within itself was, I think, questioning of where the country was and where it was going, because we had a lot of issues of the questions of different groups of residents based on race, based on class, whether they were getting equal services. That was a big part of it. Most importantly, though, was to get people saved. And when you saw so many people that were dead floating, Americans in New Orleans, that was shocking, I think, to many people that were used to seeing such horror and destruction in war or in other countries. And so the deploying of all the resources that we had was aimed at not only to tell the story, but also to help the people. That's when a business became more than just what it was doing as the news organization. It also became a corporate citizen and was trying to think, how can we help the area on top of that? So that was impressive in that every network was trying to do that. For CNN, since I was with them at the time, that's what we did. And I was humbled by that work and that group.
So you were doing a lot more than just going there and reporting. You were actually on the ground and being a part of that, kind of helping people.
Yeah, and when I was on the ground helping people was really underlined, and me helping people was maybe an overstatement, was during the oil spill. It had gone all across the area, and we were traveling just from east to west, every town that was by the water. And I don't know if we were helping people directly, but I know by telling their stories, that is part of helping people.
Do you ever feel that there was a conflict between you telling the stories and people just needing someone to maybe hand out food, for instance? Was there this feeling of conflict of, oh, I'm just this third party where I could actually be actively helping?
When it comes to health and safety, that's when the journalist, which is supposed to be removed and observing, when you turn off the lights, you put on your human hat. And of course, yes, you help where you can. Me reporting on human trafficking has always been a difficulty of understanding that line of when do you take off the journalist hat and put on the human hat and then you help, right? That was always difficult for me because we get to fly away and they stay. So those who are kept as slaves, modern day slaves, and forced into having sex, you do want to help. And yet you have to be a journalist. So what brings you there is your journalistic nose, right? Is your job as a journalist. So when do you take off the journalistic hat and when do you put on the human hat? And so that is why I volunteered for so long and still do on issues of human trafficking and gender equity. Because if I'm in a story, when you take off the journalist hat, then do you go in there and you try to take them all out? Well, are you capable of doing that? And I'm not, because if I remove them, guess who's still there when I leave? The pimps, and they will harm them and they'll harm the family. And so what do I do when I take off the journalist hat and be the human hat? Is by volunteering for those sorts of NGOs and CBOs. And that's the way that I was able to balance out what I was learning and then doing something about it. I know that telling their story was, to me, just as important because it got the word out about this was happening.
And so some of the NGOs you worked at included Plan International USA. You say that you are a 7-year-old feminist. How did that come about?
I'm a 7-year-old feminist. And the reason why I say 7 years old is because when I started reporting on human trafficking, I guess 12 or 13 years ago, I started to see the same thing in every country I would report on it. And I didn't understand why women and girls were always the victims and survivors of human trafficking, more often than not, 80% of the time. And it's because, in, I should say, all countries, that women and girls are often seen as not first class humans. And what does that mean? Well, it is differing degrees. I know it's a strong statement. Like in the United States, women make 80 cents on the dollar. They make 80% of what a man makes, everything else being equal. Why is that? So that's the sort of case similar in every country. My mother, for instance, her own family, why is it that the brothers didn't have to do the books or the cleaning? Why did she have to only study from 1 a.m. to 3 a.m. in the morning? How come her brothers didn't pick up and so that she could do that? So she could study during normal hours. So that is what opened my eyes 7 years ago. And the reason why I say I'm a 7-year-old feminist is because I got a lot to learn, right? The thing is, just because you're a guy and all of a sudden you say, yeah, gender equity is important and that I will stand up for it and I'm a feminist because of that, And it's a strong word, and I know it can be polarizing. I say it in a way that hopefully is not polarizing. I don't want it to be polarizing, only to say that I have a lot to learn. Because for you, Lingya, you have many more years of experience of what that means to be a woman in the world compared to me. And so I don't want to ever say to you, for instance, or any other women that because I'm a feminist, all of a sudden I'm in and I get it. No, I don't. It takes a long time to learn what that means. And you are far more steeped in experience and knowledge on it, Lingya, than I would ever be. But I still doesn't mean I can't be part of the solution.